2.3 deals with the question I noticed from Councillor Charles regarding Stock Road, Crozier Road subdivision. Someone like to move it had been received, and Councillor Charles, thank you. Seconded by Councillor Cheek-Whitten.
Can I have a word, please?
Discussion. Sorry, Councillor Joyce.
Can I have a word, please, on this one?
Yep.
Thank you. I move the recommendation to be received, but before I speak to it, I have 4 questions I wish to ask along with my opening explanation, please. Mr. Mayor, your custom is to ask members, do they understand the motion, and is everybody quite clear on the motion? This is an excellent safeguard and correct procedure to before asking for the vote. So, will you please make an explanation to the Council and the media why you will not answer these questions so that I'm able to cast my vote? Also, 2, why the documentation I requested in question 4 has not been supplied. I requested the documentation on the 7th of October in good time for this meeting, 16 days notice. The documentation I sought was to provide me with the confidence and assurance that your statement made in writing, on email and reproduced in this agenda addressed to Mr. Blatchford, the Council and the public is accurate. Mr. Mayor, your response to the agenda you state, there have been virtually thousands of communications and multiple investigations/reviews in relation to Stock Road over the past 7 years. Reading on, you say, if Councillor Charles can provide some specific original documentation that has given rise to this questions, Mayor Philp may then understand the context and be able to consider a response. Mr. Mayor, I believe you may have overlooked or misunderstood my request, so for clarity for the meeting and for those soon to cast a vote, I must read one sentence from your email addressed to Mr. Blatchford, which is reproduced in the agenda tonight. Quote, your preamble allegations have been raised and investigated many times by the ICAC Commissioner, the Ombudsman, the Planning Minister, the Local Government Minister and the ERD Court. This exact same statement has featured in 2 other separate replies from your email to Mr. Blatchford and CC'd elected members on the 22nd and the 28th of August 2017. My third question, can you now see that I am requesting the documentation to and from the 6 state government authorities listed by you which confirm your repeated written statements? My advice and understanding is that the specific allegations raised by Mr. Blatchford have not ever been investigated by any of these persons or departments listed, and most certainly not even by the ERD Court. Do you wish to make any correction to your assertions?
Thank you for your question, but all elected members were advised by an email with all the information back in 2016 with what was going on and the results of what was going on. So that information's already been given to elected members. I can't help it if you don't read it.
Take the questions on notice.
Thank you. We need to pass the recommendation on questions on notice from that. We're not debating that, so you're happy with where you're at the moment?
There might be somebody else who wants to make a comment, otherwise I'll complete what I've got to say.
Okay. Last comment, quickly.
I've asked 4 questions and you've provided 1 answer. You say that is in this agenda. You say your determination, the questions are vague and improper. I believe my questions are certainly not vague and improper. I believe any reasonable person's assessment would be they are definite, clear, alert and not vague, fitting, suitable, proper, honest and not improper. Also, I believe that any reasonable person would be satisfied that these questions are legitimate and should be answered, not swept away and dismissed out of hand. These questions require full disclosure and clearest, most transparent answers possible so the public can have confidence in Council and its deliberations and the decisions made. I believe you have not provided full disclosure to the elected and the public, and this could be seen by some as intentional. Your answers over months and years on the subject have been, in my determination, vague, improper, irrelevant and insulting both to myself and the public. And if I had some support tonight, I'd ask for your resignation.
I'll cover that now if you like. As I inferred on a further discussion that we had just recently in this meeting, you are an elected member and need to have some sort of support for Council. Council has made a recommendation in relation to Mr. Blatchford's matters. And
Ultra-vires, I believe.
well, that's only his recommendation, not yours.
Your Worship, I'd like to make a motion without notice in
Yep,
relation
thank
to
you.
the report. My motion that is any future matters in regard to Crozier Hill Estate and the floodplain be referred directly to the Ombudsman's office and not dealt with in council. The reason for that is that, as Councillor Chick-Whitten said, this matter has been dealt with for a number of years. Council has had a full briefing on this matter when we came to council. Peter Charles talked about that. There's hundreds of questions that have many been answered before. I think when I was looking through the questions for this agenda, there's a number of questions in both item 4.1, item 19.7, item 19.5 that are exactly the same question that have been asked on a number of occasions. This is just, I think irresponsible.
Open for discussion. Yes, Councillor Musgrave.
Well, it's no surprise I'll be speaking against this very strongly. Councillor Jenkins is all very clever, but she's only been here for 2 years and she has got had no access to previous information that had been supplied to council on several occasions. She's only relying on what someone else has told her, not from her personal experience. I believe that this motion is ultra vires because it's stopping an elected member from doing his or her job. Doesn't matter whether it's Councillor Charles, whether it's me, Councillor Andrews, Councillor Hales, anybody who asks a question about this will be told we're not answering it. And I don't think that the council's got a right to do that. It may not like the democratic process, but the democratic process is there, and it's there for everybody to use, and nobody should be stopped from doing it. This place is getting like Stalin with Russia, because we're being told we can't ask questions about certain things. We're being told that the mayor is not going to entertain the question because it's vague or insulting or some rubbish, and it's just stopping elected members from doing the job they're elected to do. So, as far as I'm concerned, this is ultra vires, and I'm sure it'll be found to be so. You can't make up these sort of motions on the run without doing your homework.
Thank you.
Sorry, Mr Mayor, can I just say then, what I'm saying is, does not the council have a set of accurate maps, survey maps for its whole area? It seems strange that it doesn't, and it seems strange that we can assess developments without actually having that to refer to. At the end of the day, it's the council planners and or the development assessment panel that needs to give the nod to things. If they haven't got the information to verify what a planner or a developer or even an engineer or a surveyor is saying, we could make an awful mistake.
Sure, thanks, Your Worship. No, council don't have extensive floodplain mapping for the entire area. So if council were to do that and to update its development plan and go through a development plan amendment, it would need to do that as a separate process that would need all the requisite investigations. So, and that would have to consider more comprehensively the entire river and possibly also the Hindmarsh River as well.
Thank you, Your Worship. Could I put a quick supplementary onto that? He's completely missed that point, of course. The people out there have instructions where they cannot build or have developments, and that is within the floodplain. And yet we're not provided with any map that can show you a floodplain. So really you've made instructions to us, so you haven't explained that, Mr Pathouse. Could you explain how we know where the floodplain is when you're only talking concept floodplains?
That's why if you want to build, you need surveyors to make sure you're not in the floodplain.
Are you suggesting we get a hydraulical assessment?
Thank you. That's
a hydraulical assessment costs $30,000. If we want to build a chook shed, that's quite an expensive outlay, Your Worship. Thank you.
I can't believe what I'm hearing. I think every elected member in this council swore an oath to look after the interests of the ratepayers. For someone to try to tell an elected member of this council that there are certain questions they just can't ask, I think is just reprehensible and beyond the joke. I don't think we need to seek legal advice. Why do we always have to go and spend money on legal advice? Yes, about the rocks, that's good value, but not about this. What concerns me is the end of the motion that says, and that no further response to the report or the questions posed be sought from administration. Now, does that refer to elected members? Does that refer to members of the public? Who does it to the media? Who does it refer to?
You've already spoken, Councillor Charles.
Well, I'll put in the point of order then. Maybe I'll get an opportunity to just clarify that when it comes to staff and embarrassment of the council, I refer to Part 3, Section 94, that is Part 4, in considering whether an order should be made under subsection 2 is irrelevant that the discussion of a matter in public may cause embarrassment to the council or council committee concerned or employees of the council, or cause a loss of confidence in the council or council committee. This is quite clearly will apply to questions as well.
Could I have a question, please?
You've made a comment.
Could I have a question, please?
Question?
Question. How much are we thinking of spending on legal advice on this? Because if you're saying that this is the same matter as the Blatchford matter, we've already spent $500,000 on it and got really nowhere. All the advice that I've ever had on this matter has been behind closed doors, with notes unavailable to the people who are being addressed. And if you want to relate it to Mr. Blatchford was never allowed to be in the room and to argue his case. So I'm really worried about spending more and more money on lawyers. It just seems that some people think that it's an inexhaustible supply of ratepayer funds to spend on lawyers, which I think is just appalling. Because I asked the CEO essentially for an opinion on whether the motion moved by Councillor Jenkins was ultra vires. And the reason that I asked that was because I strongly believe it is ultra vires. There are two parts to it which I think are both beyond the powers of council, ultra vires. And I also wanted to highlight the dangers of making up motions on the run and getting them wrong. You need to sit down and think about motions before you just make up something in most cases, and instead of just chucking it the first thing that comes up. So no, the question has been answered. I mean, I don't know whether I have to put it so plainly that the grade 1 kid could understand it, but my question is clearly, was that motion ultra vires? And I haven't had a response. We've gone off on a tangent, we've raised other issues, we've talked about the CEO not being able to get a word in to tell the Mayor that I assume that he thought it might be a problem motion. Yet we've seen tonight that the CEO is able to get a word in when he wants to. It's just, I don't know what's going on with this, because it'll make us a laughing stock if the Mayor accepts ultra vires motions and the CEO at the time doesn't raise the issue or draw it to his attention. So, no, I'm quite concerned that essentially the CEO has refused to answer the question, in my view, and so it'll be put up again at the next meeting.
Thank you for your accusations. Yes, Graham?
Well, firstly, Your Worship, I object to Councillor Marshall referring to questions he poses to me needing to be framed in a grade 1 level. I think that's totally offensive and totally inappropriate. And I think if you read my full report, I did answer your question in the last paragraph, which actually said legal advice is not necessary at this stage, as it was quite clear to me that the motion had legal and practical application challenges. What the motion does provide, albeit ultra vires, is a reason to exchange dialogue with the Ombudsman about the circumstances surrounding this whole issue, which with a view to extracting some advice. I'm pleased to say, Councillor Marshall, that I've had that discussion with the Ombudsman on Thursday, and he concurs with both yours and my view that the motion was in fact ultra vires.
Well, thank you.
This one is tonight addressing the floodplain development approval dispute. Specifically, the planning approvals granted by the Victor Harbour Council and the Crozier Hill Estate, situated on Stock Road, Swains Crossing, Inman Valley. Concerns by the block owners of this estate have been brewing for around 20 years, and tonight we will be enlightened to much of the turmoil over that time. I'm Barry Wright, and I'm the chair of the Action Group and your MC for the night. I'd just like to introduce you to the other members of our committee that are here tonight. Jean McGough. I quite often miss Jean, so I've mentioned her tonight. John Voigt in the middle. Patsy Wright, same name as me, so obviously my wife. And Bob Bash in the front here. Two of our members tonight are away, Warwick Westlake and Bob Bash. And Sue McGrath. Now, I'd also like to welcome the candidates of the forthcoming council elections whom are in attendance tonight. I won't go through the names, but I see there's a few of them around, and thank you for coming. And I hope tonight's forum can add to their topic knowledge, which should prove valuable should they be elected, as no doubt the Crozier Hill estate will continue to have a council focus through the future 4 years and as long as it goes. Just to let everyone know, we did invite all candidates tonight, and we have had apologies from four: Chris McRae, Carol Schofield, Bill Lowe and Mike Smoko. So they're the ones that have apologised that they can't make it, they've got other things on. Tonight's forum's format. We've got 3 segments tonight. The first segment will be Mr. Adrian Burton will present a pictorial timeline of the council subdivision approval process and some of the disturbing problems that have subsequently occurred since. As a concerned resident of Victor Harbour, Adrian has dedicated a great many hours and a great many years researching the associated documentation and processes, and you're going to see a lot of it tonight. Adrian did present a lot of this material at the council here a couple of months ago, but there's a bit of maturity since then, Adrian, so there's more information as it's matured. At the completion of Adrian's presentation, we'll have an open question and answer session. So you'll get a chance to ask Adrian any questions of any of the elements or points that you see. The second segment will be a personal reflection on the family human toll of the outcomes of the planning approval process of the estate. We've got Mr. Ben Blatchford, Steve Nicol and Nick Hall, and they're all people that have undergone problems within the development, and they will address some of their personal experiences being block owners within the estate and what's happened and the impact on their families over the years. Each of them will talk in their own language as to what they want. At the end of that, we will then have Adrian and the three individual speakers from within the block owners, and there'll be just another question and answer. So if anyone else has got any further questions to ask, that have come out of the statements by the three, will just be a final wrap up, and that'll be the end of segment 2. Segment 3, we'll move into a formal action group membership meeting where we will seek our members' views on what actions we should undertake to progress address of the current situation to a positive outcome for both the affected block owners and the ratepayers of Victor Harbour. I know there's been statements by specific councillors, etc., that there is no impact and this should just go away. I don't think that's the fact. We will enable this with a formal motion. So what we decide to do, we'll do formally through motions and group membership voting. So it's up to the members to work out what you want us as an action group to take forward to look after the rights of the people that have been affected by this development. Just on the proceedings, just a few points. I request that all interactions tonight are respectful and sincere with genuine questions. It's hoped that a professional approach to tonight with relevant discussion can lighten all present regarding the Crozier Hill estate development. We normally have quite sedate and professional meetings, so we just want to make sure that continues tonight. So, with no further ado, I'll hand over to Adrian for the first segment. Thank you, Adrian.
Good evening and thank you for coming along. You can see the title that I've chosen for tonight is the Stock Road Saga a community issue? One of the questions, a critical question is, if it is a community issue, are we stakeholders? And that's an important consideration that will be explained later. The question then is it a community issue and are we stakeholders? The views expressed are personal opinion, are offered without prejudice and in good faith by a layperson with no training or experience in planning, surveying or legal matters. I appreciate the opportunity provided by the Victor Harbor Community Action Group to speak. I appreciate the support that I've been given, and I especially appreciate the cooperation of Ben Blatchford and Lance Labrandy for using their photographs, and I think the photographs give an indication of what we've missed out on. I'm a bit of a creature of habit, and I go to the same bakery each week and I get my bread, and I notice there is a little container and it's got all sorts of little things in it. Do you know, I have never ever tried what's in that little container box, that little sampler. And it occurred to me that there are a lot of people who probably don't know much about Stock Road. So what I'm going to try to do tonight is give a sample of Stock Road. The presentation doesn't attempt to provide all the answers to a very complex issue of long standing. It provides a sample of one person's perceptions concerning a most important sequence of events. Several questions are presented for the community members to consider, and the insight and response of others is encouraged. In keeping with the idea of having a sample, I'm going to give a sample of what's going to come tonight. So I'm quickly going to go through the structure and speak to each of those briefly, and then we'll go back and look at each one in detail. You've suffered the introduction already. Number 2, a key decision, probably the key decision. And that decision was made by full council in March of 2000. And they approved a land division. The interesting part in particular was that it was a land division that involved floodplain land. And one of the first things we would have thought would have been done would be to get a surveyed map defining the floodplain, because there can't be development in a floodplain. But if you don't know where the floodplain is, how can it be divided up? But it was divided up without a map. And that is the key decision. I'll come back to that later. On the 3rd of September, I gave a presentation in the council chamber. This is not the same as that, but it contains some similar elements, because until you get a grasp of the beginning of the history, you can't understand the context that's come later. The Fife report, Victoria McCurdy was given authority to spend up to $20,000 to engage an independent planning consultant to look into the planning matters, but only the planning matters of the first subdivision, and there have been 2. That report makes very, very interesting reading. It was conducted by Michael Osborne, who's the Managing Director of Fife Enterprises, or Fife Proprietary Limited. I don't know what their title is. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is what's not in the Fife report, because what's not in the Fife report is just as interesting as what is in the Fife report. And I'm not being detrimental. I'm not meaning to make a snide comment. I'm saying Michael concentrated on what he was given the brief to do. He wasn't given the brief to look at other things. That's what I'm trying to say. But it is those other things that are very important and they need to be considered. So what's not in the Fife report is as important as what is in the Fife report. One of the main topics tonight, I'll be looking at the subdivision of Lot 25. That's the second land division that was authorised by Council. Then we'll be looking briefly at the human cost, the cost to unknown families. I don't like the term unknown. I didn't mean unrecognised, but people I may not know. That's what I was trying to say. There might be people affected. In fact, I'm pretty sure there will be people affected who don't know they're going to be affected, and quite seriously affected. The Hall family, Nick's here tonight. Nick's in a situation where he, in good faith, bought a block of land and approximately 80 to 90% of it is in a floodplain. I believe he was sold a block of land that is not fit for the purpose for which it was sold. So Nick will have a word. Ben Blatchford is here. He'll have a word. Very, very interesting story. Started out in about 2010, his family put in an application to build a house. The planning department recommended approval for the development house. CDAP didn't give approval, same organisation. Then he looked and discovered they both were supposedly using the same map. They came to two different answers, and that has engaged now in a dispute that's gone on for 8 years. The Nichols family. Steve's here. What a remarkable story. When Steve purchased his block of land, there was a levelled pad. He thought, that's a convenient place to build a house. I'll build my house there. So he sent his plans in. They said, yes, you can build your house there. What has transpired is that levelled block was part of a watercourse which had been levelled. He has built not on the floodplain, he's built plumb fair dinkum in the middle of an old watercourse that's been filled in. And in order to do that, they diverted a watercourse. You'll see it. Excuse me. Then we'll have a wrap up and a question time. The key decision. A key decision was made by full council on the 27th of March in the year 2000 to approve the initial Crozier Hill land division, which included land on the floodplain of the Inman River. A map defining the extent of the floodplain was not provided when crucially important decisions were made. Very easy to say, but it's a huge statement. Assessment of the development was not delayed until the documentation was lodged. You would imagine if you and I were going to put a house application in and we didn't have the right documentation, they'd say, hold on, we can't do it at this month's meeting, we'll have to do it at next month's meeting, we'll do it as soon as you get your documentation in. Oh no. No documentation, no worries. Approval was given without requirement, without the required documentation. So if I wanted to build a house in Victor, number of bedrooms uncertain, setback from the road uncertain, construction materials uncertain, but a detailed documentation will be provided after approval. You'd say that would never ever happen. It has happened, and a huge development it is. We're not just talking about a house, we're talking about more than 40. How do I know this? because we've checked the dates. On the left, you'll see a fax from Tonkin and Associates, a very reputable firm. I've got no objection to them at all whatsoever. Mr. Ken Schalk was the hydrological engineer from B&C Tonkin, and he sent a fax to Mr. Bob Andrews, who was the proprietor of Andrews Surveyors. He was also the consultant to the developer, Mark Stock. That is dated the 30th of April. You probably might not be able to see it, but you'll just have to take my word for it. You're welcome to check it, but it is dated the 30th of April. And there were two organisations working together. One was a hydrological engineering company, and the other was a surveying company. Two different companies, but they joined forces and produced a couple of maps. So on the 30th of April, Ken Schalk sent not an email, they weren't going then, a fax to Bob Andrews saying, please find attached 10 and 100-year ARI floodplain maps for the Crozier Hill development. Now, he said, you will note that the 100-year floodplain extends further to the north than on our previous maps. What an understatement. What an understatement that was. This is a copy of the surveyed hydrological assessment that Ken Schalk said he was going to send to Bob Andrew and did send, dated the 30th of April. Approval was given on the 27th of March. So the map wasn't commenced until after approval had been given. It is alleged that approximately 20 acres of unique floodplain land that was intended to be entrusted to our council has been included in land that has been subdivided and sold for private profit. The question that I'm going to ask, has this resulted in our community having been disadvantaged by action taken by our council? Are all residents and ratepayers stakeholders in the Stock Road saga? Here's a burning question. Have the processes undertaken concerning each of the two Crozier Hill land divisions been consistent with the standards of professional practice that the community considers to be acceptable? We'll come back to that at the end, and I'll ask you that same question if you can keep it in mind. Part 3, the meeting on the 3rd of September. An independent review of the Crozier Hill Land Division was approved by Council in the year 2000, has been undertaken. The first draft, the Fife report, was presented to the public at a meeting held on the 3rd of September. I gave a PowerPoint presentation on that night. I'm going to very quickly go through, like a steam train, that first part, the acceptance of the first subdivision or land division. This information is available on a website that launched South Coast TV, so people are welcome to take their time and look through that in detail, but you'll excuse me, I'm going to go pretty quick for the first part because it's the second part that I want to concentrate on. The unique features of the Crozier Hill Land Division were recognised. Council knew well and accepted the difficulties of having a development on the floodplain. They recognised it immediately. The rezoning of land created about 40 rural living allotments occupying an area of 59.8 hectares, about 150 acres. It extends for about 1.5 kilometres from Swain Crossing Road to Glenvale Road. It was a major development. So when we say approval was given without documentation, approval for a major development, a huge development. A plan was agreed to do three things: protect the environment, provide safety for residents and protect assets. All going well. They did a great job. Very sensible. The main points were, the first thing was to define the extent of the floodplain, to work out where was the floodplain. Then to accept that there was to be no development in the floodplain. Land which was not in the floodplain was available for sale under certain conditions and to be developed under certain conditions. But land that was within the floodplain was not to be developed and was to be actually set aside as a reserve vested to the local authority, which is our council, which is another way of saying vested to the community, a community reserve. And this work was expressed in principles of development control. Now that's official sounding language, I'm sorry, but there's no way around it. That's the nuts and bolts. Figure 4 is a very important map. It's referred to frequently. It looks pretty mundane and not very interesting, but it's of vital importance. You'll see the shaded area, and there's a bit of a dotted line around the outside.
Excuse me, I think we might be a picture.
The boundary of the floodplain is the boundary of the reserve. Full stop. The boundary of the floodplain is the boundary of the reserve. It says so in figure 4, and the very first principle of development control says development should be in accordance with figure 4. It should be in accordance with the principle that all land within the floodplain is to be reserve. Now, there are three principles, three pillars. The first is principle 1, which says development is to be in accordance with figure 4, which you've just seen. The second one, land is to be divided in accordance with figure 4 and a hydrological assessment that defines the borders of a 100-year flood. That's the map you've seen. That's what it's saying. Those two things need to be taken together. Not one in isolation, but two of them together. If you use one, you've got to use the other. And principle 9 is that all floodplain land next to the Inman River should be part of a reserve entrusted to the local council. And those three principles sit on the foundation of figure 4. That's the theory over. The 4 stages of the land division could be represented by 4 maps. The first map that we're going to have a look at is an approximate hand-drawn map. This was produced by Andrews and Tonkin. It's the first concept. That changed into a surveyed plan of division for development, which is what was taken to the council and approved by council. Then after that comes the surveyed hydrological assessment. I know you should say it should come before it, but it came after it. And then finally the deposited plan that was approved, what was actually approved by the Lands Titles Office. And the question is, were any of those maps consistent with principles 1, 7 and 9? Were they at any time consistent? Photograph of Ben holding a map. Ben and the floodplain are synonymous. We're going to look first of all quickly at the introduction of the 4 maps, and then we're going to go through in detail quickly each of those 4 maps. The 4 main maps have been produced by professionals working on behalf of the developer, Mr. Mark Stock. I just say that these are not maps I've drawn. These are maps produced by the consultant working for the developer. The second map is the plan of division for development, and the yellow area shows the main focus that I'm interested in. It's a 150-acre development, so I'm not making comment about the whole development. I'm looking at that part which is on or adjacent to the floodplain. And down in the right-hand corner is an all-important signature and date, which we'll talk about later. I could have got a clearer map, but it didn't contain the signature and date. This is another copy of the surveyed hydrological assessment. You might note down the bottom, if you've got good eyes, this is version G. There's a whole family of maps. They've all got the same basic core information, but some of them have got a little bit more information, different information. The same core. This one has got a red line which depicts figure 4. It's not on all 999254 maps. So if it starts off with 999254, it all uses the same core information. This happens to be version G. I showed you version 1 before. This is a copy of part of the deposited plan. Now, the interesting thing is there have been 4 new maps. As every one of them has been produced, each one has claimed progressively more of the floodplain. Remarkable. Each of the 4 maps has claimed progressively more of the floodplain. Right, we'll look now at a bit more additional detail and we'll go through each of the 4. We've been told this map defined the extent of the 100-year floodplain and was used in the assessment of the land division. I don't believe that's correct, but that's what we've been told. How can it define the extent of the floodplain when written in Ken Shawk's own hand it says approximate extent? If it's approximate, it can't be definite, can't be defined. If it's defined, it can't be approximate. And the second thing I'd say is, even if it happened to define the extent, which it doesn't, why was a second map necessary? If they're saying this map defined the extent, why was it necessary to spend about 20 or 30 grand to do a second map? And why did the second map produce such a dramatically different result? This is the outline of the Crozier Hill land division. And it shows those curvy black lines, which I'll enlarge later, are the approximate extent of the floodplain, and the yellow area is floodplain land to be sold or floodplain land that was sold. This is an enlarged section of that same map. Now, there are two critically important questions here. You'll notice the floodplain is defined not by the natural position of where a 100-year flood would go. It's now defined by straight line boundaries of allotments which have encroached onto the floodplain. I've never seen a flood flow in straight lines. Does that comply with council policy? The answer is no, it doesn't, because council policy says all land inside the floodplain is to be reserved. It's as clear as anything. There is land inside that black line marked yellow, which is for private sale, but it should be reserved. So that leads to the question, could the initial hand-drawn map show an intent not to comply with council policy? And I believe it does. From day one, no map has ever complied. From day one, they have said, we're not even going to try to comply. We're going to tell you straight up, right from the beginning, we're going to claim some floodplain land and we're going to sell it. And they did, with gay abandon. This is the map that was given to elected members. The reason for the red line is to show that some of the maps have got that Swains Crossing Road, incidentally. Some of them are depicted with that on an angle and some of them have it perpendicular, and that changes the configuration of the flood line. It's the same flood line. I hope you understand what I'm getting at. It's not a consistent, different maps have used different ways of drawing it, and the previous slide, for example, Swains Crossing Road was vertical. Not a big deal. Okay, this is an enlarged portion of the Plan of Division for Development. The blue line is the 25-year contour, curvy. The green line is the 20 metre contour. You'll see there the red line represents the approximate 100-year flood line, and again the yellow area depicts between the red and the black, that is floodplain land that was sold. I would ask you to remember reserve is block number 43 and 5 hectares. And I'm asking you to remember because I can tell you it doesn't stay at 5 hectares and it doesn't stay as lot number 43. Councillors were denied access to the development plan and did not grasp the significance of the map. A councillor asked in council, could we please be given a copy of the development plan? What he was asking for is a copy of the principles as well, because the development plan contains the principles. He was told, an elected member was told, no, you can't have it, by a director. When that map was approved, I have it on good authority from people who were there, those people had no idea that what they had approved was contrary to council policy. They had no earthly idea. It was never explained to them. plan of division for development, down the bottom is this signature and a date, and typed in that little area is vouched for in accordance with Development Act 1993 regulations. My question is, how accurate is this statement? Because if the map doesn't comply with principles 1, 7 or 9, and it doesn't, does it comply with the Development Act? And we'll come later to see that the Development Act says if a development doesn't comply with the development plan, it's not an authorised development. That's just to refresh your mind, that's the defined floodplain map, the surveyed map. This is that same map with 3 sets of data on it. The 100-year flood line, the 10-year flood line, and the figure 4 flood line. The figure 4 was the original concept, don't worry too much about that. The area in green is the area set aside for reserve, and you'll note that it's got all straight lines, and with the exception of one small area which I'll point out later, all of the boundaries are inside the floodplain. If you take the 10-year boundary and you block out the area, suddenly that red area gives you an idea of how much land has gone missing, if you like, has been sold, which should have been community land. But that's only the 1 in 10-year flood. The blue area is the 1 in 100-year flood, and it's the 1 in 100-year that's in the development plan. Yep. Everything in green should be reserve, was intended to be reserve, was written into the development plan to be reserve. But it's not. That whole green area from the northern red boundary to the southern red boundary on the other side of the river, lot 29, that's next block. We'll talk about that later. If you look back now at the surveyed map, that red outline is the extent that should have been set aside for the community as a reserve. It's a huge area. It is 30 acres. And those yellow circles represent the lot numbers of the lots as you work along. And each of those lots would be 1.7, 1.8, 2 hectares roughly, something like that. Now, I won't go through the figures, but what's happened is as the reserve was decreased by a hectare, the land available for sale was increased by a hectare. Roughly, not exactly 1.0, roughly. And you'll note now that the reserve is lot number 45. Whoops, it was 43 before. It's now 3.99 hectares. Oops, it was 5 hectares before. Something's gone on. Now, 3 fundamental slides, same image. Evidence has not been found that any of the relevant maps depicting the 4 stages of the Crozier Hill Land Division have at any time been consistent with the specific principles of land division numbers 1, 7 and 9 in the Rural Living 4 zone of the Council Development Plan. Now, the development plan may not be a legal or compulsory document, but that doesn't mean it can be ignored. There's always a certain amount of flexibility. We understand that, but to ignore it is a no-no. Council was required under the Development Act, Section 33, to assess the Crozier Hill application against its development plan. Evidence shows such a course of action could not have been undertaken. How could the development application have been assessed against a hydrological appraisal that defined the extent of the floodplain when that survey was not commenced until after approval was given? So it is impossible for them to say that that proposal was assessed against the development plan. It's impossible. They couldn't have done it. I won't spend time on this. It just shows little copies of the map where it changed from 5 hectares to roughly 4, and the area of private land increased. Now this is an interesting little slide. This is the actual decision notification, and you'll notice it says lot 2 lots into 40. Approval was given for 40 allotments. We've already found they started at 43, then they're up to 45. Now, if we look at a page of their actual notes in the development assessment file notes, you'll see it's up to 47. And when they approved the subdivision of lot 25, it was up to 48. Approval was for 40. Part 4, the Fife report. This was conducted by Michael Osborne and qualified planning staff from Fife Proprietary Limited. A budget of $20,000 was made available. No recommendations are contained in the report, but the 5 concluding remarks are provided. And you can all get a copy of the Fife report. It's contained in the September 2018 Council agenda. Now, I'm going to go through each of these 5 concluding statements. The first one, in our opinion, Council should have had further and better information to inform the planning assessment, and in particular a detail and contour survey which would have assisted to identify the spatial extent of the 100-year ARI. That's planner language for the boundary of the floodplain should have been defined, and it wasn't. That's what it's saying. And by sheer coincidence, they've said a detail and contour map should have been made available. The map 909254 is titled Detail and Contour. So what it's really saying is that's the map that should have been made available. Part B of the point number 1, this information was, in our opinion, required. Required? If it was required, whose job was it to make sure it was undertaken? Whose job was it to supervise? Whose job was it to report? Because it was a requirement. That single statement, in effect, supports those persons who have been trying for years to convey to deliberately deaf ears that Principles 7 and 9 in particular were not adequately considered, and consequently a flawed approval decision was made. The second summarising statement that Michael Osborne makes, and I'm not critical of Michael Osborne in any way, I'm not meaning that, I'm not trying to convey that at all. Council obtained independent expert opinions in relation to hydrology, and based on the correspondence of council files, commentary in the agenda and associated minutes, did consider the issue of flood risk in making its decision. So it's saying the issue of flood risk was important, it was recognised and they looked into it. My question about that is, that's all well and good, but could subsequent internal approvals have resulted in increased flood risk? Like if you give approval for someone to build their dream house on a floodplain, is that likely to increase their risk of flooding? Number 3, council was open to make its decisions to approve the land division, notwithstanding that elements of the proposal, in our opinion, did not satisfy certain key provisions in the development plan. What really, and it's taken a long time for me to swallow, but what this review has set out for me is, even if it was a bad decision, a biased decision, an improper decision, a wrongful decision, even if it was not in the best interests of the community, whatever, it was a legal binding decision. Councils can make mistakes. It was a legal binding decision and it would be very, very difficult to overturn. It would involve something like a judicial review. And Onkaparinga Council, just in yesterday's paper, have set aside a sum of $300,000 to look into a judicial review. So we're looking at big bucks. However, the fact that it was a legal binding decision doesn't mean it was made by well-informed councillors, was consistent with council policy, was undertaken via a sound and appropriate process, was in the best interests of community and environment, was supported by a majority of the community, and was ethically acceptable. Point number 4. There is uncertainty in respect to the process and therefore analysis which was undertaken by council, which resulted in a reduction in open space reserve from 5 hectares down to 3.9. There was uncertainty. I would have thought an independent survey, a review, would look into the reasons why. I find it staggering that they simply say there is uncertainty. No mention is made of the approximately 20 acres that was meant to be reserve, which may also be attributed to uncertainty of process, the uncertainty of not knowing where the jolly boundary was. And number 5. Council's actions in negotiating the subsequent land management agreements appear to be fair and reasonable. These land management agreements are complex documents that ideally there was no need for. The basic principle is there is no development on the floodplain. If there's no development on the floodplain, why do you need a complicated, expensive land management agreement specifying finished floor levels and pages and pages and pages of calculations working out what's likely to be the effect of a flood? The cheaper, simpler option was simply to say no development on the floodplain. Part 5, what's not in the Fife report. Here we go. The subdivision of Lot 25. Now, unlike the original 2000 land division, the subdivision of Lot 25 was undertaken entirely by council staff. It was a Category 1 development. So we don't have to worry now about saying, well, these poor old councillors who were out of their depth and really couldn't be expected to know what doesn't come into it. This decision was made by permanent, experienced, professional planners. Okay, so there's Lot 25. What the Lot 25 subdivision did was to divide, basically dead in half. Lot 25 was very close to 2 hectares. They divided it in half, 1 hectare each, and they put a long, skinny entry road. Some people call them battle axe blocks or hammerhead blocks or something like that. Let's have a look at what the Development Act actually says. Section 33, matters against which development must be assessed. Not should be, must. A development is an approved development if and only if a relevant authority has assessed the development against and granted consent in respect of each of the following matters. A, the provision of the appropriate development plan. They've got to consider the appropriate development plan. There's no doubt they have considered it. The question is how they've considered it. What was the nature of that consideration? And their notes tell the story. I'm only going to concentrate on page 1 because you're all going to go to sleep if we get further involved. But this is just a sample, remember. This is just looking at page 1. I'm going to make comments about tried and trusted principles 1, 7 and 9. This is a blow-up of their writing. Principle 1 is given a tick, is in accord, existing road network. Principle 7, both allotments have suitable area above 1 in 100, ARI, average recurrence interval that means. Principle 9 has already occurred during the original land division, meaning so it's not necessary to do it again. Let's look at each one of those. Development should be in accordance with figure 4. The development assessment file note says it is in accord. How on earth can it be in accord? Because figure 4 says all land inside the floodplain or inside the defining boundary of the floodplain should be reserved. Look at the area inside the blue line, which is the 100-year flood line, and the pink line is the 10-year flood line. All of that land is meant to be reserved, and yet they've said bold as brass, is in accord. No explanation of how they believe it's in accord, just a statement. Bang, it's in accord. Secondly, existing road network. What in heaven's name has the existing road network got to do with principle 1? Where does it say anything about road development? Let's look at principle 7. Land should generally be divided in accordance with figure 4 and having regard to a hydrological assessment defining the extent of the floodplain. The note says both allotments have a suitable area above 1 in 100. So what? That's not what it says. It says land should be divided in accordance with figure 4. Is it divided in accordance with figure 4? No. Has it regard to a hydrological assessment defining the extent of the floodplain? No. It's just simply said there is some land available there somewhere that's big enough to build a house on. Never mind if 90% of the block's in the floodplain. Let's have a look at principle 9. Any division of land abutting the Inman River should result in the vesting of the river alignment and its floodplain as depicted in figure 4 as part of open space. The development assessment file note says we don't have to consider this. It has already occurred during the original land division. Whoopie-doo. So what? The principle says any division, meaning any division. And for them to say it's okay because it's occurred in the original consent. We know it did because it cost us 20 acres. To say that it's excusable to use the finding of the original subdivision is rubbing insult into injury, because the original decision was badly flawed to the tune of 20 acres. What's the human cost? When Steve purchased the rural living allotment, some earthworks had been undertaken, and he saw fit to use that pad to build his house on. No explanation was made. You can imagine Steve's amazement. I think it was in November. I did that from memory, and I put a question mark to check it and I forgot. But I think it was in November of 16, this map appeared, and Steve said, "What? There's a map showing a watercourse flowing straight through my house." Council had had it since 1999. That tells a story. The yellow dash line on the left shows the original beginnings of a watercourse. It would have flowed down here. When they put Stock Road in, they lifted the level up, stopped the flow of the watercourse, so they diverted it about 100 metres into another creek. Someone got a bulldozer out, filled in the end of the watercourse. Part of the watercourse is still there, 1 metre deep by 4 metres wide, still there. You can see it today. That was sold to someone who should have been told what was happening. The other yellow line is the existing Green Hills Creek. You can see Steve's family home in red, and we'll pick it up later. There are distinctly green areas some more than 5 years after they stopped the flow of all surface water. Steve showing some of the rising dampness that has become an ever-present cancer, progressively eating away at the dream, the home and the well-being of his family. There is a natural drainage system that's been operating for centuries. You don't have to be Houdini to work it out. That's the way of natural drainage. And there is a policy which says the division of land should take place with due regard to the surface drainage of each allotment created in the division. So there's an aerial photograph of Steve's house on the left, the access track which was put in so that the new owners could gain access to lot 102, part of the original lot 25, if that's not too confusing. And that's what the access track has done. It's stopped the natural flow of water. Steve now has got to contend with that. You would have thought when they built Stock Road and that stopped the natural flow of water, they would have realised the damage that can be caused by putting in a raised road which interrupts the natural flow of water. Is Steve got to put up with that? we're not just talking about some little insignificant stream. There's a fair deal of water that flows down that. That's the diversion. That's flowing along the edge of Stock Road. Now, the council policy says important natural resources, including watercourses, should be conserved and protected from development which would affect them adversely. I can't think of anything that's going to affect it more adversely than closing it down and diverting it fully. Completely contrary to council policy, but it's been done. Here it is again. This is the diverted water creek. The policy says the natural character of rivers and creeks should be preserved in their own development plan. The natural character of rivers and creeks should be preserved. How can it be preserved when you block it off and divert it? You'll be pleased the wrap-up's about to happen. I'm going to look at some statements made by the former CEO. I'm going to ask 3 questions for the members of the community to consider. And I've just been cheeky enough, because I'm interested in words, I've put in a little quote from a guy who taught me in primary school. The history of the world is the record of the weakness, frailty and death of public opinion. It's not dead because you're here tonight, proving that it's not dead, but it's not as healthy as it could be, and perhaps apathy might be one of the byproducts of our lifestyle. This is a copy of a letter that Mr. Maxwell wrote to some people by the name of Possingham, who are ratepayers. And there are 2 quotes in red, one quote on one page, the next quote at the next page. The quote says, "Council will require detailed flood studies to be undertaken to ensure that no allotments are located within the floodplain." That's a written statement from the CEO. No allotments are located within the floodplain. Hello? We've got 20 acres worth of allotments that are in the floodplain. And the second statement by Mr. Maxwell says, any application for development in the rural living 4 zone will be assessed against the relevant criteria set out in the plan amendment report. Any development which is seriously at variance with these provisions will be refused by council. But they didn't refuse it. Twice over. Three questions. Do you believe the decision to allow the extent of the reserve to be defined by the artificial straight line boundaries of allotments that have encroached within the floodplain rather than a flood line that has occurred in the natural environment for centuries is consistent with council policy? Is it consistent with environmental standards? And is it consistent with community expectations? Second question. Do you believe the processes undertaken concerning each of the 2 Crozier Hill land divisions have been consistent with the standards of professional practice that our community considers to be acceptable? Third question. Do you believe all residents and ratepayers are stakeholders in the Stock Road saga and have been disadvantaged by action taken by our council? Now, I hope I'm not going to come in for criticism, but I want to remind you of a tragic situation that occurred just 1 month ago, where after 45 years, a man was arrested for the murder, alleged murder of his wife, after 45 years. It could be argued After 45 years, is it worth the trouble? Tens of thousands of dollars to undertake an investigation, tens of thousands of dollars to run a court case, tens of thousands of dollars per year if that person ends up in jail. What does the community get? Well, perhaps a community develops inner strength when it remains respectful of the situation and suffering of its members. It's mighty important to the people in that case. And if it's mighty important to them, it should be mighty important for us in the community. Perhaps it may be the most expedient course of action for a community to adopt a circle the wagons attitude and possibly turn a blind eye as efforts might be made to sweep an inconvenient truth under the carpet. That might save the community money. Let's ignore it. Let's not take any questions. I've answered that question. That's irrelevant. Perhaps what's ethically sound may not be the easiest thing to do, and this is not going to be an easy problem to solve. But I don't believe we should be just lifting the carpet and sweeping it under. Perhaps the genie is out and it may be time for discussion. How many times did Peter, wherever you are, Peter, ask for mediation, ask for discussion? No. There will be no discussion. Now, I think, is the time for discussion. Now is the time for mediation. Now is the time for people to sit down, respectfully talk to each other, because it's not going to go away. Thank you.
South Coast Television, your community, your voice.